All right, good evening. Thanks to those of you who are taking the time to engage and to watch this. I appreciate it. Welcome to our workshop on global conflict and cooperation. Recall that this workshop is a series that's focused on defining, exploring, and discussing global conflict and cooperation from the point of view of different international institutions, country governments, international non-governmental organizations. Now, this is our schedule for the fall. In week one, we discussed Afghanistan. Last week, we discussed Haiti, and this week, we'll be discussing El Salvador. And then the next weeks are still in the planning phases. And if you're interested, you can also watch the summer sessions, which give you a more conceptual engagement with the topic of global conflict and cooperation. So let's go ahead and jump right into week 3 and El Salvador. So here's a satellite picture from Google Earth that shows El Salvador here in the center, and Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, Mexico, and basically the bridge between North and South Americas. So our learning objectives for today are the following. First is to identify a social or institutional conflict in El Salvador. Secondly is to explain how aviation is a cooperative effort. And then lastly, describe the United States' current engagement with the country of El Salvador. So a little bit about El Salvador. As always, I bring up the CIA World Factbook because I think it's a pretty thorough and reputable source. So we'll go ahead and read or hear a little bit about the background of the country of El Salvador. I think we lost that connection there. We're going to play this.
El Salvador achieved independence from Spain in 1821 and from the Central American Federation in 1839. A 12-year civil war, which cost about 75,000 lives, was brought to a close in 1992 when the government and leftist rebels signed a treaty that provided for military and political reforms. El Salvador is beset by one of the world's highest homicide rates and pervasive criminal gangs.
And in addition to that short introduction, goes into details about geography, people and society, environment, and so on. So I encourage you to take a thorough look at this webpage so you get a general sense of the country of El Salvador, at least the mechanics behind it. Next, I also like to share the United States Department of State's webpage on El Salvador. And we can go ahead and play this portion here.
The United States established diplomatic relations with El Salvador in 1863 following its independence from Spain and the later dissolution of a federation of Central American states. Post-independence, the country saw a mix of revolutions, democracy, and a 1980 to 1992 civil war. After the signing of peace accords in 1992, the Salvadorans have consolidated their democracy through an uninterrupted chain of elected governments. The United States and El Salvador share a strong commitment to democracy, rule of law, and inclusive economic development. Ties are further enriched by more than 2 million Salvadorans who call the United States home.
And so that gives you a general description of how the State Department defines, or at least prefaces, the relationship between the United States and the country of El Salvador. And again, I think it's important to note out that when you're looking at any country, it's not just about the U.S. perspective, but it's the home country's perspective as well. We don't get into that too much, but I just want to make that clear that each country has its own, typically has its own government, its own system, its own society, and it has its own understanding of its relationship with the world. So we're seeing this from a U.S.-centric perspective. Now, going into the elements of conflict, there's 2 resources I want to share. First is a book about national belonging, and the second one's more recent news about the judicial independence or the judiciary's independence in the country of El Salvador. So let's go ahead and take a look at those 2 things. And I'm going to change the voice options here just to kind of change it up a bit for us. And we'll play this accent. Okay, so this is a book by Professor Robin Maria de Lungen. She teaches at the University of California, Merced, where I went to school. I've known Robin now for a long time, 10 plus years. And when I first met her, she was doing research in El Salvador. And this is one of the books that she published from her work. And she studies social memory. So I want to just have this read to us about what this book is about on reimagining national belonging.
Reimagining National Belonging is the first sustained critical examination of post-Civil War El Salvador. It describes how one nation, after an extended and divisive conflict, took up the challenge of generating social unity and shared meanings around ideas of the nation. In tracing state-led efforts to promote the concepts of national culture, history, and identity, Robin DeLugan highlights the sites and practices as well as the complexities of nation-building in the 21st century. Examining events that unfolded between 1992 and 2011, DeLugan both illustrates the idiosyncrasies of state and society in El Salvador and opens a larger portal into conditions of constructing a state in the present day around the globe, particularly the process of democratization in an age of neoliberalism. She demonstrates how academics, culture experts, popular media, and the United Nations and other international agencies have all helped shape ideas about national belonging in El Salvador. She also reveals the efforts that have been made to include populations that might have been overlooked, including indigenous people and faraway citizens not living inside the country's borders. And she describes how history and memory projects have begun to recall the nation's violent past with the goal of creating a more just and equitable nation. This illuminating case study fills a gap in the scholarship about culture and society in contemporary El Salvador, while offering an ethnography of the state that situates El Salvador in a global context.
And so it gives you this. What's really thoughtful about this book is that it's an in-depth, very rich case study. Professor DeLugan made many trips to the country of El Salvador to conduct her research, and basically bringing and knitting together this very well thought out and well explained and illuminating history and notion of social memory, social construction of past, and basically how that feeds into the prospects for El Salvador today. And I think this is just an interesting aspect to demonstrate that there is a recollecting of the conflict that that country's endured, and how it shapes its society is a meaningful sense of how conflict doesn't just happen and then it's over, right? But that it has a lingering or a long-term effect on the people of a country and of a nation. The second one I'd like to share is an article from the Human Rights Watch on laws that have been passed in the country of El Salvador that threaten the judiciary's independence. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. And we'll have these first few paragraphs read to us. And I'll change the voice options on this one again too, just to change it up a bit.
Washington, D.C. Two laws passed by El Salvador's Legislative Assembly on August 31, 2021, threaten judicial independence by allowing authorities to dismiss all judges and prosecutors who are 60 years old or older, Human Rights Watch said today. The bills passed by the Legislative Assembly, which is controlled by supporters of President Nayib Bukele, said that judges and prosecutors age 60 or above will immediately cease their functions. While it is not clear how many judges will be affected, some estimates indicate that over 200 of the about 700 judges in the country may be ousted and replaced by judges appointed by the Supreme Court, which Bukele's allies in the assembly recently packed. Since Bukele's supporters took control of El Salvador's assembly in May, they have taken drastic measures that appear aimed at destroying the independence of the Supreme Court and the Attorney General's office, said Jose Miguel Vivanco, America's director at Human Rights Watch. These laws seem designed to ensure government control over a large number of lower-level judges and prosecutors. The new legislation will apply to all judges and prosecutors, except those on the Supreme Court of Justice. Previously, the law did not set a mandatory retirement age for judges and said that they could retire after 35 years of service. The new laws allow the Supreme Court to extend the term of judges who are 60 or older due to reasons of necessity or specialty, and the Attorney General to extend the term of prosecutors for reasons of convenience or due to the complexity or specialty of their services. Such provisions are vague and could easily be used to reward judges and prosecutors loyal to the government, while ensuring that only those who are independent or perceived as independent are ousted, Human Rights Watch said. Since he took office in 2019, President Bukele has undermined basic democratic checks and balances. He has publicly defied rulings by the Constitutional Chamber of the Supreme Court prohibiting arrests for violations of COVID-19 related measures and accused judges of being genocidal. In February, his party, Nuevas Ideas, won a two-thirds majority in the assembly. On May 1, hours after the pro-Bukele assembly was seated, legislators ousted and replaced all the judges of the Supreme Court's Constitutional Chamber, as well as the Attorney General. The lawmakers clearly took the action, in violation of international standards on judicial independence, because they disliked the judges' rulings.
So this article goes on to describe the ramifications of these political decisions that were made by the incumbent president and then the newly elected or newly empowered national legislature. And the way to describe it is like in principle across the country, the idea of a democratic norms and society is that you have an independent judiciary and that it shouldn't be swayed or influenced by political branches of the government, typically the executive and legislative branches. And so the idea here is that that norm is being violated in this country. But I think I want to point out that not having a detailed understanding of this country's political system and its political dynamics, it should be noted that in the United States, for example, you could have the Congress and the president pass a law that has mandatory retirement ages for lifelong judges, or what we call, and what we do have is what we call senior status. So after a certain age or a certain amount of years, judges can move from serving as an active member of the judiciary to a senior status, which means they, have a lighter caseload, but they're not a full judge. Or they're a full judge, but they don't have the full workload responsibilities as they do in their normal time. And so it isn't uncommon for the political branches to shape the nature of the judiciary. And this is actually a topic that I studied when I wrote my dissertation on how Congress and the presidency shape the judicial branch in very structural and fundamental ways. So when I read this article, I think I would need more context because I don't have a history or an understanding of the country of El Salvador. But the way it's framed by the Human Rights Watch is that this is a violation of a norm and this is something to be paying attention to. So this is an example of institutional conflict. Okay, so now on to cooperation. And I definitely want us to talk about what's happening right now, which is a World Cup qualifying match between the United States and El Salvador. Unfortunately, I don't have a stream to it, so I can't show us on the screen, but I do have a clip of folks talking about the game that was going to get started. So I'll go ahead and let that play for, I don't know, a minute or two, just to get a sense of what's going on. But sadly, we are missing out on it due to my lack of access to stream and probably some copyright rules as well. So let's go ahead and listen to these three fellas talk about this match.
Focusing on the international break, lads, this is a big one. I know it is for you guys, especially. The US men's national team are back in World Cup qualifying for the first time since 2017. My question to you is, are the USA favorites to qualify for the 2022 World Cup from the CONCACAF region? Think about that carefully. I'm just going to say, are they favorites to qualify for the World Cup? Because we've waited 4 years now for this chance, this shot of redemption. We've all been talking about Trinidad and Tobago and the horrors there and the ghost of that shocking loss late in the qualifying campaign. So it starts. You can watch the games on Telemundo Deportes on NBC Universo. So all those details are on Pro Soccer Talk on NBCSports.com to watch all the World Cup qualifiers from the CONCACAF region. So, gents, the USA start with playing at El Salvador, then they're at home against Canada, then they're playing at Honduras. First 3 games, I'd say that's okay, right? So, Nick Mendola, how are you feeling about the squad and what kind of...
So I'd have to watch the rest of it. I'm actually pretty interested in what they have to say. But I just share this because when you think about conflict and cooperation, you're like, is a soccer game really about conflict or is it about cooperation? And I think it's both, right? Any soccer match promotes kind of peace and understanding and engagement around the world. And obviously it's a conflict because, they want to win. So one team has to win, one team has to lose unless there's ties are allowed. But it's also an example of conflict, right? Where representatives of 2 countries come together, engage in a game with a set of rules. And then at the end of it, one's the winner, one's not the winner. And then they shake hands and move on to the next match. So I just wanted to put this in there kind of to show the levity of when it comes to global conflict and cooperation. It isn't all just politics and government, right? It's also these other things like international sports and the like. Okay, so now let's get to our cooperative part. And I want to start with an article that's titled Volaris will launch a new airline in El Salvador. So let's go ahead and take a listen on this article. And we'll have this read in, put this in reader mode because this helps just a bit. And let's have it play from the top.
Volaris will launch a new airline in El Salvador. The Mexican low-cost carrier Volaris aims to continue growing its presence in Central America. The company is close to launching its new branch, Vuela El Salvador, or simply Volaris El Salvador, as a low-cost national operator in this country. Let's investigate further. Volaris will launch a new airline in Central America. Photo. What do we know about Volaris El Salvador? Volaris sees an area of opportunity in Central America. Before the Mexican company arrived, the region didn't have any low-cost operators. Each country has a small regional carrier, except for El Salvador, which has Avianca. For instance, Guatemala has TAG Airlines, a carrier with a fleet of Saab 340 and Embraer EMB 145 aircraft. Honduras has CM Airlines, Costa Rica has operators like Skyway, and Panama has Copa Airlines. But none of these airlines is low cost, therefore, Volaris discovered a niche of opportunity. In a recent statement, the company announced that Volaris El Salvador will start operations in the country in September 2021. During the last investors' conference call, Volaris management spoke about the Central America opportunity. Enrique Beltranena, Volaris CEO, said, "We are on track to launch Volaris El Salvador by the late third quarter to complement our presence in Costa Rica and enable us to take advantage of route rights from El Salvador, the biggest Central American VFR markets, to the U.S. Volaris currently has branches in Mexico and Costa Rica. How many aircraft could Volaris use in Central America? The Central American region is key to Volaris. The airline is looking to diversify the Mexican revenue base, generate more US dollars-denominated revenues, and maintain low operating costs. Moreover, Volaris wants to take advantage of market opportunities left by weaker competitors in the region," said Beltranena. Currently, Volaris Costa Rica has a fleet of 3 Airbus A319-100 aircraft, with an average age of 13.8 years, according to CH Aviation. While the airline hasn't officially announced how many aircraft it will send to its branch in El Salvador, it believes there could be a potential of between 18 and 22 aircraft in Central America in the medium term.
And so this article goes on to describe, what routes would Volaris El Salvador operate, and the new Honduras flights that they have or that they're planning. And you might be asking, so how does this relate to a global cooperation? Well, note that an airline doesn't just find an airport, land a plane, and pick people up, right? It is actually a very complicated process. And I just want to unpack how complicated of a process it is and how much it requires cooperation from a range of entities, country governments, international aviation organizations, both governmental, non-governmental, trade associations, and then airline manufacturers. So let's just unpack this just a bit so you get a sense of how complicated this cooperation has to be. So first, I'm opening up a link to the Federal Aviation Administration's webpage on international aviation, and the FAA stands for the Federal Aviation Administration. This is a U.S. governmental entity. And here on their page, you'll see that for international aviation, they have different parts: Code Share Safety Program Guidelines, International Aircraft Certification, International Flight Information Manager, an office, and North Atlantic Resources for U.S. operators, overflight fees, and prohibitions, restrictions, and notices. And I just want to open up this International Aircraft Certification link. And it describes things like bilateral agreements, working procedures, reciprocal acceptance, these fees, and so on. So let's just open these bilateral agreements. And actually, we'll do the overview one, so it gives us a sense of what these are. So I'll let these two things play. So you just get a quick definition of these things. And let me change the voice just to mix it up a little bit again.
What are bilateral agreements? Bilateral agreements facilitate the reciprocal airworthiness certification of civil aeronautical products imported/exported between two signatory countries. A bilateral airworthiness agreement, BAA, or bilateral aviation safety agreement, BASA, with implementation procedures for airworthiness, IPA, provides for airworthiness technical cooperation between the FAA and its counterpart civil aviation authorities. Type of bilateral agreements. Bilateral airworthiness agreements. Bilateral airworthiness agreements are executive agreements concluded prior to 1996 through an exchange of diplomatic notes between the U.S. Department of State and its foreign counterpart based on FAA technical recommendations. Note, the U.S. no longer concludes bilateral airworthiness agreements. Bilateral Aviation Safety Agreement. In addition to airworthiness certification, bilateral aviation safety agreements provide for bilateral cooperation in a variety of aviation areas, including maintenance, flight operations, and environmental certification. For aircraft certification, an additional document, and implementation procedures for airworthiness, is developed to address specific areas such as design approvals, production activities, export airworthiness approval, post-design approval activities, and technical cooperation.
And so that sounds like a lot, right? And the way to summarize it is this: that no plane gets to fly from one place to the other without a lot of engineers, scientists, and government officials saying it's okay. And I'm talking about a lot of folks, right? The next thing I want to share is the iCow. You might be asking, what's iCow? And no, it's not a new TikTok or something like that. Let's listen to the overview. And I'm going to let this play here.
About ICAO. ICAO is funded and directed by 193 national governments to support their diplomacy and cooperation in air transport as signatory states to the Chicago Convention, 1944. Its core function is to maintain an administrative and expert bureaucracy, the ICAO Secretariat, supporting these diplomatic interactions, and to research new air transport policy and standardization innovations as directed and endorsed by governments through the ICAO Assembly, or by the ICAO Council, which the Assembly elects. Industry and civil society groups, and other concerned regional and international organizations, also participate in the exploration and development of new standards at ICAO in their capacity as invited organizations. As new priorities are identified by these stakeholders, the ICAO Secretariat convenes panels, task forces, conferences, and seminars to explore their technical, political, socio-economic, and other aspects. It then provides governments with the best results and advice possible as they collectively and diplomatically establish new international standards and recommended practices for civil aviation internationally.
And so for the International Civilian Aviation Organization, right, it's a partnership between 193 countries, which is almost all of them, I'm sure, I think almost, where they say, this is how we're going to fly. This is how airlines are going to go from one place to the other. And we're going to figure it all out so that we can allow for air travel around the world, civilian air travel. This doesn't include military elements. So know that there are these organizations out there that are dedicated to the cooperation of these kinds of efforts. Lastly, implications with respect to El Salvador. I want to share this recent news article about Vice President Kamala Harris's visit to the Central American region. And let's go ahead and listen on that, and we'll wrap up with that and then the discussion. Let me zoom in a bit here. We'll have this first few parts play.
Washington, AP, Vice President Kamala Harris on Thursday announced commitments from a dozen companies and organizations to invest in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador as part of the Biden administration's efforts to address the root causes of migration from the region. Participants in the new program include corporate giants MasterCard and Microsoft, as well as ProMujer, a nonprofit that focuses on providing aid to low-income women in Latin America, along with the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and the World Economic Forum. Harris issued what her office described as a call to action for businesses and nonprofits to make new commitments to promote economic opportunity in Central America. At an event announcing the initiative, Harris declared that private businesses have a very significant role to play in creating jobs and promoting economic opportunity and creating long-term development. Leaders in the effort joined Harris virtually and in person Thursday for the event at her ceremonial office. Luis Vonon, CEO of the language learning app Duolingo, said in a blog post Thursday that about 500,000 people in the Northern Triangle region already use Duolingo's advertising-driven free app, mostly to learn English and improve their job prospects. The company also offers a $49 online English proficiency test accepted by many colleges in the U.S. and elsewhere, and as part of the White House call, he said it's going to waive the cost of the test for many Central Americans. Vonon said he grew up in Guatemala City in the 1980s and 1990s, a particularly unsafe time in my country's history, but was lucky to be able to go to a good school and come to the U.S. for higher education.
And so the article goes on to describe Vice President Harris's and President Biden's efforts to strengthen the relationship between the United States and that region in an economic, commercial, social way, as opposed to a strictly economic or strictly military way. Given the long history that the United States have had in the region, both positive and negative, it's important to point out that this was this trip was highly anticipated, since it was one of the first, if not the first, that Vice President Harris took in her role, and focusing on building this kind of community, this coalition of public, private, nonprofit sectors to see what they can do to contribute to the standard of living and the opportunities that are available to individuals in those countries. And so I think it's important to note here that this is an example of when you have a long-standing history with the country, and then you see that this country has both elements of strength, but also elements of weakness. In their case, a civil war that went on for about a dozen years, and then the spillover effects and the lingering effects of that. And then you have elements of like different, governmental leaders trying to change their governmental systems. But we also have these elements of cooperation, right? And it's not just a matter of hoping that things work out, but doing the hard work, the day-to-day work at all levels, from the person who's living day to day in their neck of the woods to folks who are thinking about the foreign policy implications of engagement with country governments. And so hopefully this gives a little bit of light for us about the country of El Salvador. It's a rich country, rich history, rich culture. And hopefully this gives you just a peer into it to begin building your understanding of our relationship with it and the country's relationship with others around the world. So with that, we'll go ahead and stop the recording and engage in our discussion. Thanks again, and have a great night.